I still remember the sound, before I remember the pain. It was the sound of wrapping paper tearing, children laughing, plastic toys clinking against the floor. We were all sitting in my mother's living room. Same couch, same carpet, same family gathering we had every year. My mother sat in her chair, smiling, handing out gifts to each grandchild. Big boxes, colorful bags, envelopes with thick edges. One by one, the kids opened their gifts. New shoes, tablets, gift cards. Every child was called by name. Every child was celebrated. Then my mother turned to my son. She smiled the same way, reached into her purse, and handed him a small, white envelope. My son looked up at her and said thank you. He was polite. He always was. He opened the envelope carefully, slowly, like he didn't want to tear it. There was nothing inside. No money, no card, no note. Just empty paper. The room went quiet for half a second. Not long enough for anyone to speak. Just long enough for everyone to notice. My mother didn't say a word. She looked away. Someone laughed awkwardly. Someone said, "Kids don't care about money anyway." But my son sat there staring into that empty envelope. Then he looked at me and whispered, "Did Grandma forget me?" That question didn't break my heart. It carved something out of it. Because this wasn't about money. And it wasn't a mistake. This was the moment I finally understood something I had ignored my entire life. This wasn't the first time my mother chose someone else over me. And it wasn't even the worst thing she had done. It was just the first time she did it to my child. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever been told not to make things awkward, if you've ever swallowed hurt just to keep the peace, you may want to stay with me until the end of this story. Because what happened after that empty envelope changed the way I saw my mother, my family, and myself forever. And before we go any further, if stories about family betrayal, emotional truth, and quiet karma speak to you, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. That way, even if life pulls you away halfway through, you can always come back and find stories that remind you you're not alone. Now let me ask you something. If your child was the only one handed nothing, would you stay silent? Because I did. And the price of that silence is something I'm still paying for today. I didn't say anything that day. Not when my son handed the empty envelope back to me. Not when my mother avoided my eyes. Not when the room slowly returned to laughter and noise. I smiled. I always smiled. Because staying quiet had been my role in this family for as long as I could remember. Growing up, I was the easy one. The child who didn't complain. The one who didn't need much. The one my mother liked to describe as strong. She said it like it was a compliment. My brother needed help. My sister needed support. They had bigger personalities, bigger problems, bigger emotions. I learned early that love in our house was not divided evenly. It flowed toward the loudest need. When my brother messed up, my mother stepped in. When he struggled financially, she covered it. When he made mistakes, she explained them away. When I struggled, I adjusted. I worked longer hours. I budgeted better. I didn't ask. And when I finally became a parent myself, I thought things would be different. I truly believed that grandchildren would soften her. That once there were children involved, fairness would come naturally. At first, it almost seemed that way. She held my baby. She took pictures. She posted them online with captions about family and blessings. But slowly, the pattern returned. She showed up more often for my brother's kids. She watched them after school. She took them on weekends. When I asked for help just once, she sighed and said she was tired. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself not to compare. Comparison, I had been taught, was selfish. Every holiday made it clearer. My children received gifts that were fine, practical, simple, while the other kids received things they talked about for weeks. Trips, experiences, things with excitement attached to them. And every time my mother had an explanation ready. They already have so much. They're so easy to please. You know, money is tight. Money was never tight when it came to the others. Once, years before the empty envelope, I gently asked her about it. Not accusing, just curious. She looked at me with genuine surprise and said, "I didn't think you cared about things like that." That sentence stayed with me because it wasn't true. I did care. I just wasn't allowed to, and neither were my children. Over time, I learned to prepare them quietly. Before family gatherings, I would say things like, "Remember, gifts aren't the most important thing. Grandma shows love in different ways." I told them these things so they wouldn't feel what I felt growing up. But children notice. They always do. They notice who gets called first, who gets hugged longer, who gets remembered without reminders. And deep down, I knew I was teaching my kids the same lesson I had learned. That love had conditions, and silence was the price of belonging. So when that empty envelope appeared in my son's hands, it wasn't a shock. It was confirmation. Confirmation that this wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't age. It was a choice. And for the first time in my life, I realized something else too. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was teaching my child how much he was worth. And I was running out of excuses for why I kept letting this happen. That gathering wasn't for a birthday. It wasn't for a holiday either. It was one of those just because family get-togethers my mother liked to host. The kind where she cooked too much food, lined the kids up in the living room, and made a show out of being the center of everything. She loved moments like that. Loved being seen as the generous grandmother, the one who held the family together. The gifts were arranged carefully on the coffee table. Colorful bags, boxes stacked by size, envelopes placed neatly on top. She called each child forward by name. Not randomly, not casually. There was an order to it. My brother's oldest went first, then the next, then the younger ones. Each time my mother smiled, waited for the wrapping paper to tear, and watched everyone's reaction. Compliments followed. "Oh, that's perfect for you. I knew you'd love it." She soaked it all in. When it was my son's turn, she hesitated. Just for a moment. It was small. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. But I did. She reached into her purse, instead of the pile, pulled out a thin white envelope, and handed it to him, like it was no different from the rest. "Here you go, sweetheart," she said. My son stood up, smiled, and thanked her, because that's how he was raised. He sat back down and opened it slowly. I watched his hands, watched his face. At first he smiled. Then he frowned. Then he looked inside again, and again, like maybe he had missed something. Then he held the envelope upside down and gave it a small shake. Nothing fell out. No one said anything. Not my mother, not my brother, not my sister. Someone coughed. Someone picked up a plate. Life kept moving. My mother leaned forward and reached for the next gift, already calling another child's name. That's when I knew this wasn't a mistake, because if it had been, she would have stopped. She would have apologized. She would have laughed it off. She would have fixed it. But she didn't. She acted like everything was normal, like my child hadn't just been quietly excluded in front of the entire family. I felt something rise in my chest. Not anger, embarrassment. Not for myself, for my son. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to say something. But I didn't, because all the old instincts came rushing back. Don't cause a scene. Don't embarrass her. Don't ruin the day. I told myself I would talk to her later, in private, calmly. That's what I always did. After the gifts were finished, the kids ran off to play. My son stayed close to me. He didn't cry. He didn't complain. He just held the envelope in his hand, like it still mattered. At one point, my mother walked past us. She glanced down. Our eyes met for a second. She looked away. No explanation. No acknowledgement. That hurt more than the empty envelope itself, because it meant she knew Later, someone joked about how kids today were spoiled anyway. Someone else said gifts weren't important. I nodded along. I always nodded along. But inside, something had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't questioning whether I was being too sensitive. I wasn't wondering if I had imagined it. I saw it clearly. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't carelessness. This was intentional silence. And as we drove home that night, my son sat quietly in the back seat, still holding that envelope. That thin piece of paper carried more weight than any gift in that room, because it held a message he hadn't learned how to read yet. And I realized, with a tightness in my chest, that if I didn't do something soon, he would learn it from me. The car ride home was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. The kind where you can feel words sitting in the air, waiting for permission to exist. My son sat in the back seat, buckled in, looking out the window. He didn't ask for music. He didn't ask for his tablet. He held that envelope on his lap, like it was fragile. At a red light, I glanced at him in the mirror. He noticed and looked away quickly. That's when I knew he was thinking. Children don't always cry when they're hurt. Sometimes they go still. When we got home, he took off his shoes carefully, hung up his jacket. Everything he did was slow, controlled, like he didn't want to cause any more trouble than he already thought he had. I started making dinner, pretending things were normal. A few minutes later, he came into the kitchen and placed the envelope on the counter. He didn't slide it toward me. He didn't push it away. He just set it down between us. Then he said very quietly, "Mom." I turned to him. Did Grandma forget me? The question was simple. No anger, no accusation, just confusion. I felt my throat tighten. I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it again, because I didn't know what to say without breaking something in him. I told him what I had always told myself. "I don't think she meant to hurt you." He nodded, but he didn't look relieved. After a moment, he asked another question. Did I do something wrong? That was the moment. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about gifts. This was about worth. My child was searching his own behavior, his own existence, for a reason he had been singled out. I knelt down in front of him and told him the truth. "No," I said, "you didn't do anything wrong." He accepted that answer too easily. That scared me, because it told me this wasn't the first time he had felt overlooked. That night, as I tucked him into bed, he asked one more question. "Do you think Grandma likes me?" I paused. Every instinct told me to say yes, to protect him. But something stopped me. Instead, I said, "I think Grandma has trouble showing love the same way to everyone." He thought about that. Then he said something I wasn't ready for. "It's okay," he said. "I'm used to it." Those 4 words hit harder than anything else that day. I sat beside his bed long after he fell asleep, listening to his breathing, watching his small hand rest on the blanket. And I saw myself, the same quiet acceptance, the same early understanding that fairness wasn't guaranteed. I remembered being his age, watching my mother praise my siblings while I stood just outside the spotlight. I remembered telling myself that being easy was safer. That night I realized something painful. I hadn't broken the cycle. I had softened it, explained it, made excuses for it, but I had still passed it down. The next morning, my son went about his day, like nothing had happened. He laughed, he played, but I noticed small changes. He didn't talk about Grandma anymore. He didn't ask when we'd see her again. Something had closed, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, and that scared me more than any confrontation ever could, because silence had been my coping mechanism. And now it was becoming his. That was when I knew this story wasn't just about what my mother had done. It was about what I was allowing to continue, and whether I was brave enough to stop teaching my child that love should be earned by being invisible. I waited a few days before saying anything to anyone. That's how I'd always handled things in this family. Give it time. Let emotions cool down. Assume good intentions. I told myself that if I brought it up too quickly, I'd sound dramatic. So I waited. but the silence from everyone else was louder than anything I could have said. No one called to check on my son. No one asked if he was okay. No one mentioned the envelope. It was as if it had never happened. A few days later, I met my sister for coffee. We talked about work, about the weather, about nothing that mattered. Finally, I said, "Did you notice what happened with Mom and my son?" She didn't look surprised. She stirred her coffee slowly and said, "I figured you'd bring it up." That answer alone told me everything. "So you saw it," I said. She nodded. "And you didn't think it was strange?" She sighed and leaned back in her chair. "You know how Mom is," she said. "She doesn't mean things the way they come out." I waited for more. There was nothing. Later that week, I spoke to my brother. I didn't accuse him. I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked, "Did you think that was fair?" He laughed softly, not unkindly, and said, "You're reading too much into it." Then he added something that made my stomach drop. "It's always been like this." He said it casually, like he was commenting on the weather. That was the moment it became clear. They all knew. They had always known. And instead of challenging it, they had adjusted their expectations around it. The next time we were all together, I watched them more closely. I noticed how conversation shifted when my mother entered the room, how people laughed a little louder, agreed a little faster. No one wanted to be on the wrong side of her. When one of the kids acted out, I noticed who corrected them and who pretended not to see it. The pattern was everywhere, and I had been part of it. That realization stung, because I wasn't just the person being hurt. I was also the person helping keep the peace at someone else's expense. I remembered all the times I had told myself, "It's not worth it. She won't change. Let it go." Those phrases sounded wise, mature, but now they sounded like excuses. One afternoon, my mother called me. Her voice was cheerful. She talked about an upcoming family dinner, asked what I planned to bring. I waited for her to say something, anything. She didn't. Finally, I asked, "Do you remember what happened with my son last time?" There was a pause, just long enough for me to know she remembered. She cleared her throat and said, "I don't think we need to make a big deal out of that." That was it. No apology, no explanation, just a reminder of the unspoken rule. Don't disrupt the image. I hung up the phone and sat there for a long time, because in that moment, I understood something painful and freeing at the same time. This wasn't just my mother's behavior. It was a family agreement. Everyone had agreed in their own quiet way that some people mattered more than others, and the cost of belonging was pretending not to notice. That's when I stopped asking myself why my mother treated my child differently and started asking a harder question. Why had everyone else learned to live with it? And why had I been doing the same thing for so many years? After that phone call, I couldn't stop thinking, not about the envelope, not about that one afternoon, but about everything that had led up to it. Once I started looking back, the memories came faster than I expected. They weren't dramatic moments. No shouting, no obvious cruelty. Just small things, quiet things, the kind of things that are easy to dismiss until you see them stacked together. I remembered birthdays. My mother always remembered the others' birthdays early, weeks in advance. She asked what they wanted. She planned. For my kids, she asked a few days before, sometimes the day of. "I didn't know what they were into this year," she'd say. I remembered holidays. She insisted on hosting them. She liked control, liked tradition. But when we arrived, there was always a seating arrangement that somehow placed us on the edges. Not bad seats, just not central. I remembered school events. She showed up to recitals for the other grandchildren, sat in the front row, took pictures. For my kids, she always had a reason. Traffic, a headache, something else that needed her more. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter, that kids wouldn't notice, but they did. I remembered money. My mother never spoke openly about it, but I saw where it went. She helped with down payments, covered emergency expenses, paid off debts that weren't hers. When I needed help once, just once, she told me I was more responsible than that. I remember feeling proud of that word back then. Responsible. Now it tasted different. It sounded like justification. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't favoritism born out of confusion or age. It was a system. My mother rewarded dependence. She invested in the children and grandchildren who needed her to feel important. The rest of us were expected to manage, quietly. And if we did it well enough, we were rewarded with distance. I also realized something harder to admit. I had benefited from this system in a twisted way. I was praised for not needing much, for not asking, for being low maintenance. That praise had kept me quiet. It had trained me to believe that asking for fairness was the same as being selfish. And my children had inherited that belief. That's when the envelope stopped being about my mother. It became about me. I saw all the moments where I had smoothed things over, where I had laughed things off, where I had told my kids, that's just how Grandma is. I thought I was protecting them, but what I was really doing was teaching them to accept less from the people who claimed to love them most. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with grief. Grief for the child I had been and for the parent I thought I was becoming. One night, after everyone else was asleep, I pulled out old photos, family gatherings, holidays, smiling faces. In almost every one I was there, but rarely in the center. I looked happy. I always looked happy. That's when I understood something painful. Being present is not the same as being valued, and silence is not the same as peace. The envelope had just made the invisible visible. It had forced me to stop pretending that this was accidental. It wasn't. It had never been. And once you see a pattern clearly, you can't unsee it. That's when I knew I couldn't keep moving forward the same way, because the cost of staying quiet was no longer just mine. It was my child's. And that was a price I wasn't willing to keep paying. It took me a few weeks to speak to my mother again, not because I didn't want to, but because I needed to be sure of what I was going to say. I wasn't angry, at least not in the way people expect anger to look. I was tired of explaining things away, tired of swallowing words, tired of teaching myself and my children that discomfort was the price of belonging. When I finally asked her to talk, I did it calmly. No accusations, no raised voice, just a request. We sat at her kitchen table, the same one I had done homework at as a child. She poured coffee, straightened a stack of mail, anything to avoid looking at me. I started simply. I want to talk about what happened with my son. She sighed, not in confusion, in annoyance. I knew this was coming, she said. That hurt more than I expected, because it told me she had already decided how she felt about it. I asked her why she had given my son an empty envelope. She didn't deny it. She just said I didn't think it mattered. I waited. She added, "He's young. He won't remember." That's when I realized we weren't having the same conversation. I told her what my son had asked me that night, the questions, the silence. She listened, but her expression didn't change. After a moment, she said, "You're making him sensitive." I felt something tighten in my chest. I told her I wasn't asking for gifts. I wasn't asking for money. I was asking for awareness, for fairness. She leaned back and crossed her arms. "I've done a lot for this family," she said. "I don't think it's fair to question my intentions." There it was, the wall. I tried one last time. "I just need to know," I said. "Do you see how different this looks from our side?" She looked at me then, really looked. And she said something I don't think she realized would change everything. "I didn't think it would hurt you this much. Not him, me." That sentence told me all I needed to know. She wasn't surprised my child was hurt. She was surprised I was affected. I asked her if she was willing to do things differently going forward. She hesitated. Then she said, "I don't think I should have to walk on eggshells in my own family." That was her answer. No apology, no promise, just a boundary of her own. I left her house feeling strangely calm, because clarity has a way of doing that. For years, I had hoped for acknowledgement, for understanding, for some sign that she would choose differently if she could. Now I knew. She could. She just didn't want to. And for the first time, I stopped asking her to be someone she had never been. That conversation didn't end our relationship, but it changed it. Because I walked away knowing something essential. I was no longer confused. And sometimes the most painful conversations are the ones that finally tell you the truth. I didn't confront my family after that conversation. I didn't send a long message. I didn't explain myself again. I simply changed my behavior. At first it was subtle. I stopped being the one who reminded everyone about birthdays. I stopped volunteering to host. I stopped rearranging my schedule to make things easier for others. I told myself I was just taking a break. But the truth was, I was stepping out of a role I had been playing my entire life. The role of the peacemaker. The next family gathering came sooner than I expected. My mother called and invited us over for dinner. Her tone was casual, like nothing had happened. I thanked her and said we wouldn't be able to make it. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Oh, well, maybe next time." That was it. No concern, no curiosity. The message was clear. As the weeks passed, the invitations became fewer, the calls shorter, and the comments started. My sister mentioned that Mom was hurt. My brother said I was being distant. No one asked why. They assumed they already knew. At the next gathering we did attend, the shift was obvious. The room felt colder. Conversation stopped when I walked in. I sat with my children and kept to myself. At one point, my mother stood up and made a comment about family sticking together, about loyalty, about respect. It felt directed. People nodded. I felt the familiar urge rise in me. The urge to explain, to defend myself, to make everyone comfortable again. But I didn't, because I finally understood something. Every time I explained myself, I was asking permission to protect my own child. And I was done asking. After dinner, my brother pulled me aside. He spoke quietly, like he was offering advice. "You know how Mom is," he said. "Why stir things up now?" I looked at him and said something I had never said before. "I'm not stirring anything," I said. "I'm just not pretending anymore." He frowned. He didn't understand. And maybe he never would. On the drive home, my kids were quiet. Then my son asked, "Are we in trouble?" That question hurt more than any criticism from my family. I told him the truth. "No," I said. "We're just choosing ourselves." That was the moment I felt the full weight of what I was doing. Because setting boundaries doesn't look brave from the outside. It looks selfish. It looks cold. It looks like betrayal, especially to people who benefited from your silence. The calls became more pointed after that. My mother told me I was being unfair, that I was dividing the family. She said she didn't recognize me anymore. I wanted to tell her that she had never really seen me to begin with, but I didn't. I didn't argue. I just stayed steady, and that steadiness felt like defiance to them. The final break came quietly. At another gathering, my mother gave gifts to the grandchildren again. I watched closely. When she reached my son, she handed him a small box. I felt a flicker of relief. He opened it. It was something generic, cheap, clearly last minute. I watched his face. He smiled politely, and then he placed it beside him and moved on. That's when I knew the damage had already been done. You can't repair trust with an afterthought, and you can't teach a child they matter after you've shown them they don't. That night, I made a decision, not out of anger, out of clarity. I wasn't going to chase fairness anymore. I was going to create it elsewhere, even if that meant standing alone. I didn't hear about it right away. That's how things happen when you step back. Information reaches you later, filtered, softened. It started with a message from my sister. "Mom's been having a hard time," she wrote. No details, just enough to invite concern. I didn't respond immediately, not because I didn't care, but because I had learned that rushing in only reset the old patterns. A few days later, my brother called. He sounded tired. He said Mom wasn't feeling well, that things around the house were piling up, that she needed help. I listened. Then he said something that surprised me. "We thought you might step in." That sentence hung in the air. For years, I had been the one expected to step in, to fill the gaps, to make things work quietly. But now the tone was different. There was uncertainty in his voice. I asked where everyone else was. He hesitated. "They're busy," he said. I didn't press, but I understood. The children and grandchildren, who had received the most, were the first to disappear when things became inconvenient. My mother called me a week later. Her voice was softer than I remembered. She asked how the kids were. She asked about school. She spoke carefully, like she wasn't sure how much access she still had. Then she said, "I didn't realize how much I depended on you." It wasn't an apology, but it was closer than anything she had ever offered. I listened without interrupting. She told me about doctor appointments, about feeling lonely, about how quiet the house felt. I felt compassion, but I also felt distance, because compassion doesn't erase patterns. She asked if I could come by more often. I told her I would think about it, and I meant it. That was new. For the first time, I wasn't reacting out of obligation. I was choosing intentionally. When I did visit, I noticed the changes immediately. The house felt heavier, less lively. The photos on the walls were the same, but the energy was different. My mother moved more slowly. She tired easily. She talked about family more, about how important it was, about how she wished things were closer. I listened. I didn't argue. I didn't remind her of the envelope, because karma doesn't need narration. It reveals itself naturally. One afternoon, as we sat together, she said something quietly. "I didn't think it would end up like this." I looked at her. She wasn't talking about health or age. She was talking about relationships, about the absence of the people she had prioritized. I felt sadness for her, but I also felt peace, because the balance had shifted, not through revenge, not through punishment, but through truth, the truth of who shows up when there's nothing left to gain. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't rushing to fill the silence. I let it speak for itself. The last time we sat together, there were no plans, no gathering, no celebration, just an ordinary afternoon. My mother sat by the window, a blanket folded over her knees. The house was quiet, not peaceful, just empty. My son sat across from her, older now, taller, more aware. She watched him for a long moment before speaking. "You've grown so much," she said. He smiled politely. That polite smile was new. It wasn't the smile of a child reaching for approval. It was the smile of someone who had learned not to expect much. She reached for a small box on the table. "I got this for you," she said. No ceremony, no audience, just an offering. My son thanked her and opened it. It was thoughtful this time. Something he liked. He nodded, appreciated it. Then he set it aside. He didn't linger. He didn't react much. And my mother noticed. Her face changed slightly. Not hurt. Something closer to realization. She looked at me then. "I wish I had done things differently," she said. The words were quiet, unpracticed. I waited. She didn't explain. She didn't justify. She just sat there. I believed she meant it. But meaning, something doesn't always change what it costs. My son stood up and said he was going outside. She watched him leave the room, and then said something I hadn't expected. "He doesn't need me anymore." I thought about that for a moment. "He needed you," I said. Back then, she nodded. There were tears in her eyes, but they didn't fall. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel anger. I felt closure, because I finally understood that some lessons arrive late, not as punishment, but as truth. My mother had spent years investing her attention where it was loudest, and now she was learning that love doesn't return on demand. When we left that day, she hugged my son. He hugged her back. It was kind. It was gentle, but it wasn't close, and that was okay. On the drive home, my son didn't mention the visit. He talked about school, about friends, about his life. And I realized something quietly. The moment that had haunted me for years no longer held power over him. The empty envelope had become just a memory, but it had changed everything for me. because it taught me when to stop waiting for people to become who they aren't, and when to start protecting what truly matters. As someone who has spent years listening to family stories like this, I want to tell you something important. Favoritism is not always loud. It doesn't always come with shouting or cruelty. Most of the time it shows up quietly, in who is remembered, in who is excused, in who is asked to understand, again and again. And when children grow up in that environment, they don't always become angry. More often, they become silent. They learn to shrink their needs. They learn to measure their worth by how little trouble they cause. And many parents don't realize they're repeating the same pattern until they see it reflected in their own child's eyes. What happened in this story wasn't about an empty envelope. It was about a moment of emotional clarity. The moment when a parent understands that protecting the peace should never come at the cost of a child's sense of value. Setting boundaries in families like this often feels wrong at first, because the people who benefited from your silence will call your clarity selfish. But boundaries are not punishment. They are information. They teach others how to treat you, and they teach children what self-respect looks like in real life. It's important to say this clearly. Forgiveness does not require access. Compassion does not require self-erasure. You can understand someone's limitations without sacrificing your own well-being. And sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is to stop waiting for people to become who you needed them to be. If this story felt familiar to you, if it reminded you of moments you've tried to forget or conversations you never had, you're not alone. Stories like these are shared here, not to create anger, but to create awareness. And if you find value in stories that explore family dynamics, quiet betrayal, and the kind of karma that arrives through truth rather than revenge, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. That small action helps these stories reach others who may still be questioning their own experiences. And it ensures you won't miss future stories that offer reflection, clarity, and healing. Before you go, I want to leave you with one question. What lesson do you want your silence to teach? Because children don't learn from what we say we believe. They learn from what we choose to tolerate. Thank you for listening.